Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. For this video, I thought we'd discuss the shutter button, specifically the half press on it. This idea came to me when I was looking for a Pentax SLR that I owned to review. Just in case you're not aware, at the time of me drafting this script, we are doing a poll for which film SLR brand I should have a look at. And seems like by a wide margin, Pentax has taken the lead at around 45% of the poll results. A 17% lead over the next closest brand. Pretty nuts. As a result, it eventually came that I picked up my Pentax ME Super. As of yet, I've yet to actually put rolls of film through this thing, ever, I think. I don't remember when I got this camera. I'm not really sure what circumstances came to me owning it. I think it just appeared one day on my shelf. I'm pretty sure how most of my cameras arrived to me. At any rate, just going through, examining the camera, going through the motions of taking a photo, that kind of thing, I realized that this camera had half-press technology. If you remember, when I did the video on the F2, it did not. So it got me thinking, what is the first 35mm film SLR to implement the half-press? I don't think it's this one, because this one it's not new, but it's like a late 70s. So I begun digging. But before we get into that, before we get into this hole, time to plug a YouTube channel. My brother's YouTube channel. Yes, I have a brother. He has a new YouTube channel. He also does photography content and more. His channel is called Chang of Fools. There'll be a link to it in the description down below and on a card up there. I think, click there if you'd like. Open up a tab, check it out after watching this video. Or in between, I don't know. Whatever works for you. All right. Let's get into the hole, the half press hole. So join me as I dig into the question, who done it first? Context. What is a half press? Here's kind of a fun thing. It's, at least to me, kind of weird, but I found that half press is one of those concepts or one of those ideas that a lot of people know about, a lot of people can describe, but it doesn't look like there's a universal definition for what it is. It does just seem that it is at this point, assumed knowledge if you are a part of the photographic community. I did eventually, however, find an actual description of the half press, or a definition of it, from Canon. And it went over it in an article called Knowing Parts of the Camera. Something like that. I'll link to that in the description below if you'd like to see the source material. It was part of the Canon Asia website where they post like camera-ing lessons, I think. Yeah, it seemed like actually a pretty neat resource to have, and I'm sure there's probably a North American one. I just didn't find this definition on there. At any rate, the definition is as follows. The shutter button has two stages. Half pressing the button activates the autofocus and exposure metering functions, while pressing down fully releases the shutter. That, I think, is a fairly solid definition. Good on you, Canon. Now, I also actually did find that in older manuals of older cameras, they do actually go over how to use the half press. Although, looking through a bunch of older manuals, I don't think they settled on the term half press at the time, especially around the 70s when this was a bit of not a universally accepted thing. A lot of the times you can see it referred to as a gentle press, a soft press, And some manuals, I think, actually warned do not punch the shutter. It'll release the shutter, or don't punch the shutter button. One manual actually said that, and it said that if you do that, it'll take a photo, and you want it to just meter for now. Anyways, I think the Canon definition is fairly good, but I think we can make it a little broader and a little more applicable. So for the purposes of this video, the half press will be defined as such. The half press is the first stage of a two-stage shutter button. The first stage requires less force to activate than the second stage, and it can be activated with a light touch. Usually, the button will offer resistance before entering the second stage, which requires substantially more force to engage. Releasing a finger from the first stage will return the button to its default position with no actuation. Fully depressing the shutter to the second stage will release the shutter. And on release, the shutter button will return to its default position of no actuation. There we go, some mechanical bits to define. On sustained force to activate the first stage but not the second stage, otherwise known as holding the half press position, most cameras will activate automated features of the camera required prior to shutter release. This can include things such as autofocus, metering start, metering lock, pre-capture, or other features or combinations thereof. Depressing the shutter to the second stage, the final stage, will cause the camera to take an image or series of images, usually recorded using said automated features of the first stage. Some features may lock and hold values. Some may continue to operate throughout the second stage, like auto-focusing. I think that is a fairly complete definition. Let me know if I missed anything here. Why is it important? All right, it's not that important to know who did it first, but I still want to know, since it's, I think from that one decision slash bunch of decisions maybe, came changes that would change the way cameras work fundamentally. And I think it was for the better. I like half pressing. Try to think of the last time you picked up an SLR or a mirrorless camera, a DSLR, that didn't have the ability to half press. Even a lot of older point and shoots did half pressing. You could half press to prime the focus and metering, fully press to take photo, as you normally would. I can only think of maybe a handful of cameras that are point and shoots in the past 25 years that basically only went with a single stage shutter. But really, almost everything half presses. And I know plenty of people remap parts of the half press to other functions, like changing focus activation to a separate button on the back. But just think of how many cameras default to the half press that we know today. Plus, I'm willing to bet that on most people's cameras, it's still set up that at a minimum, when you half press it, you either get metering activation or metering lock, or yeah, metering lock when you actually use the button. Most people, I think, still half press. Correct me if I'm wrong though. Do you not half press? Are you one of those savages that just mashes right down into the second stage? Because I've seen people do that. I don't like it. So who was first? All right, I'm actually not super sure. This is where things get a tiny bit dicey. I'm actually pretty certain it was the Pentax ES, with the ES meaning Electro Spotmatic, released in the early 70s. I think very early. But if I'm wrong, somebody tell me in the comments. Oddly enough, when I found the Pentax ES was the first to do this. It wasn't really something that they touted in marketing material, oddly enough, but it was described in the manual that you could gently press the shutter button and it would activate metering so you could tell what the camera was thinking. Pretty cool. And it described it quite amazingly. I'm going to actually read you the description right now. All right. Through the lens meter reading. Softly depress the shutter button. Electric circuit is now switched on. Meter needle starts moving and it indicates correct shutter speed. Electronic memory device stores exposure reading information, whether throughout open aperture or stop down aperture. That is a pretty good description of the first stage. And just an FYI, the actual selling point of the Pentax ES was that it was the world's first camera with a fully automatic electronic shutter. At the time, that was the headline of the camera. And giving the electronically timed shutter gave it the ability to do things like aperture priority shooting, my favorite kind of shooting. Fun fact about the ES, it actually combined both electronic shutter timings and mechanically timed shutter bits. In its automatic mode, it used the electronically timed shutter bits, but if the battery died and you still wanted to shoot at other speeds that were not just the one flash sync speed that's usually timed, the dial actually had a variety of mechanically timed speeds that you could still use. Sure, it wasn't the full range of shutter speeds, but as I said, it's a hell of a lot better than what you normally get on most cameras of the time, which is like this, where you have just one mechanically timed speed if the battery died. And for me, on the on the Pentax ME Super, it is 1/125th. Some cameras had it at 1/60th or 1/90th. It's typically the same as the flash sync speed. So yeah, the one downside of these electronically timed shutters is that without the electronics, you don't get the timages. So you need a battery, otherwise it defaults to just the one mechanically timed speed. What happened that started all of this? For this part, this is mostly me guessing, but I do think that at the time in the 70s, this is when we began to see the adoption of electronically controlled shutters. Now, not all cameras with electronically controlled shutters figured out the half press. For example, Olympus didn't employ half press shutter technology on their OM2, despite it having said electronically controlled shutter. Overall though, it was in the 70s that we started to see not just electronically controlled shutters, but also more integration of technology and electronics integrated circuits into cameras, and this probably started a bit of a chain reaction that resulted in a bit of an arms race, a tech arms race. And a few years after the Pentax ES, we have the Canon AE1. They also had half press technology. And we also began to see other cameras moving into the later end of the 70s. Again, the Pentax ME and the ME Super, like I'm holding here, as well as the Ricoh XR2, to name a few. And I think by the time that the 80s rolled around, this started to become a much more standard function of a camera's shutter button. Pretty cool, at least to me. And I think this generally makes sense that this got rolled in when electronically timed shutters were becoming a thing. It gave manufacturers a good reason to try to integrate more functions and more automation. And while I do think that it is probably possible that this could have been done with a mechanical shutter, and it probably would have been done in a similar setup where you have, again, 2 stages, with the second stage being purely a mechanical linkage and the first stage being an electronic interlock to activate the metering. But how would the metering and the mechanical bits actually change the mechanical shutter speed? I don't know, but this is probably why it wasn't done until we had the electronically controlled shutter to implement things like the aperture priority shooting, where shutter speeds were selected along the way. And it's probably why prior to that, for the most part, when you wanted to activate the meter, you would normally find that manufacturers would do things like. Now, it also makes sense that electronically timed shutters brought this about, since it gave manufacturers a good reason to try to integrate more functions, as well as a much more easy path to integrating things like aperture priority shooting, a new concept back in the day. Now, I do think something like this probably could have been done with a mechanical shutter, a half press where the metering activated with just a mechanical shutter would definitely have been possible. You would just treat the second stage like a normal shutter with the full mechanical linkages when you depress all the way. And then on the first stage, you probably just have an electronic interlock that activates metering. But it was probably a easier sell to implement when aperture priority shooting became a thing and you had a better reason to fully make the shutter button electronic, since you can now then rely on the electrical bits to determine your shutter speeds when the meter was on, hence facilitating a better reason to half press up a camera. But prior to that, now you can then probably understand why other cameras didn't half press. It just wasn't a necessary thing to operate the camera, especially when the meter wasn't directly tied to controlling the shutter, and all the shutter speeds were mechanical anyways. So the way that was done prior, like the Nikon F2, is to pop your film advance a little bit out, and that would turn on the meter if you did want to use it. And you could turn it off and just set your speeds manually anyways, so it didn't fully matter. I think other manufacturers had a separate button that could just activate the meter, and further still, other camera manufacturers had a switch which just had the meter on and you could turn it off. But either way, I can see why the half press wasn't a thing until the electronic bits were introduced. Conclusion. Hopefully you enjoyed going down this rabbit hole with me. It was kind of deep, and it had many branches. I have so many tabs to close now. I read through so many camera manuals. And I'd like to actually thank Butkus. If you don't know, butkus.org is a bit of a camera manual repository. And without that resource, I actually don't think I could have done this dive into the half press as well or as much as I did. And I'm pretty certain that the the Pentax ES is the first one based on the manuals that I gleaned from this website. It's an awesome site. But again, I'm not perfect. I didn't troll all of the manuals. So if anyone knows if there's an older camera that does have half press technology, let me know. While I did go through many manuals, I didn't go through all of them. Otherwise, let me know, what is the oldest camera that you have that has half press power? All right, now it's time for me to actually go take my ME Super, put some film in it, and take some photos. With that, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, maybe a super thanks, and also check out Chang of Fools. Till next time, bye.